Iran fired a barrage of ballistic missiles at American forces in the Middle East, and the United States military did not wait long to answer. Within about 24 hours, American and Saudi fighter jets were flying combat missions over Iraq, dropping bombs on targets tied directly to Iran. And by the time the smoke cleared on that single exchange, dozens of fighters were dead, a foreign worker was killed thousands of miles away in Kuwait, gas tankers were on fire in Egypt, and a fragile, days-old pause in the fighting had completely collapsed. And tonight, I want to walk you through exactly what happened, in the order it actually happened, using real sources and real numbers, because this is a genuinely fast-moving multi-country story, and getting the sequence right matters more than getting to the dramatic part quickly. So before anything else, here is exactly who is confirming what you're about to hear. This account is built from NPR's own reporting out of Cairo, from Axios reporting on the missile attack itself, from PBS NewsHour's coverage carried through the Associated Press, from The Hill's own defense reporting, from a report published through the National Desk, and from Fox News Digital's coverage of the wider retaliatory barrage, and wherever a specific casualty figure or damage claim comes from one side's own government rather than independent confirmation. I'm going to say so directly, because in a story with this many governments involved, Iran's, America's, Saudi Arabia's, Jordan's, and Kuwait's, keeping those sources separate is not optional. It is the whole point of telling this honestly. And to understand why Iran fired those missiles on that specific Tuesday evening, you have to understand what had just happened 4 days earlier. According to reporting from The Hill, the U.S. military had just spent 13 consecutive nights carrying out airstrikes against Iran, part of a broader effort to weaken Iran's ability to threaten commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz. And it is worth pausing on why that specific stretch of water keeps coming up in this war over and over again. The Strait of Hormuz sits at the mouth of the Persian Gulf, and roughly 1/5 of the entire world's oil and gas supply passes through that narrow channel every single day, which means that any government able to threaten ships moving through it holds genuine leverage over the global economy itself, not just over its immediate regional rivals. And nearly every single one of those 13 nights, Iran had responded in kind, firing one-way attack. Drones and missiles at American bases scattered across the Gulf region, hitting Kuwait, Jordan, Bahrain, and Qatar in the process. And this had already produced real documented losses on the American side. Earlier that same month, Iran had struck a U.S. airbase in Jordan directly, killing 2 American service members in a combined missile and drone attack, an event that had itself prompted President Trump to intensify American strikes into that 13-night campaign in the first place. So by the time we reach the Tuesday evening this video is actually about, both sides had already been trading blows for nearly 2 straight weeks, and this entire stretch of fighting sat inside an even larger war, one that had begun back on February the 28th, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated series of strikes against Iran in the first place, a conflict that, by the time of the events in this video, had already run for roughly 5 months without a lasting resolution, and then, according to Axios reporting, on Friday, July 24th, President Trump made a deliberate decision to pause the American strikes following a meeting with his top advisors and national security team, specifically to create space for diplomatic negotiations with Tehran, and for a few days, that pause seemed to hold. Tensions stayed high, but the shooting stopped, and mediators, particularly Pakistan, which had already helped broker an earlier interim agreement between the two countries, worked to try to get both sides back to the negotiating table, focused specifically on reopening the Strait of Hormuz and lowering the overall temperature of the war, and that is exactly the calm that ended on Tuesday evening. According to Axios and CENTCOM's own statement, Iran launched multiple ballistic missiles at American forces in the Middle East, and notably, this happened just hours after President Trump had met at the White House with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, their first in-person meeting since the two countries had launched their joint war against Iran back at the end of February. Talks that, according to PBS NewsHour's reporting, focused heavily on Iran, and CENTCOM's response to the missile attack was quick and specific. The command stated that all Iranian missiles had been successfully intercepted, and added that U.S. forces remained, in their own words, vigilant and at a high state of readiness. And multiple outlets, including Today and The Hill, described this specifically as a surprise attack, one that shattered the pause mediators had been working to preserve, and it did not take long for the American response to arrive. According to NPR's reporting from Cairo, the U.S. military partnered directly with Saudi Arabia to strike Iran-backed militias inside Iraq, and the timing and justification for this specific strike is worth being precise about, because it was not framed simply as retaliation for the Tuesday missile attack on its own. According to Fox News Digital's reporting, the American strikes were described as a response to more than 30 separate drone attacks, directed by Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps that had taken place over the preceding 72 hours. And CENTCOM issued a direct public warning as part of its statement on the strikes, saying, in the command's own words, "The IRGC and its terrorist proxies must cease these attacks to avoid further U.S. military response." And the scale of that Iraq strike, once it happened, was significant, according to NPR's reporting. Citing Iraqi officials, the joint American and Saudi strikes killed at least 20 militia fighters and 6 Iranian military advisors, and the Popular Mobilization Forces, the coalition of mostly Shiite, Iran-backed armed groups that officially operates under the command of Iraq's own military, put the toll at 20 fighters killed and 32 wounded in the overnight strikes, and it's worth pausing on that detail specifically. These are Iran-aligned militia forces operating inside Iraq, officially under Iraqi military command, being struck by a combined American and Saudi operation, which tells you how far this conflict had already spread. Beyond a simple two-country fight between Washington and Tehran, and Saudi Arabia's own defense ministry addressed its role in the strikes directly, according to NPR's reporting, stating plainly that the kingdom does not seek escalation, but will respond to any aggression directed at it. And that statement was not just rhetoric. According to NPR's reporting, the strikes were carried out specifically in response to alleged drone attacks that had targeted Saudi Arabia itself, and satellite imagery from Planet Labs, dated July 27th, actually shows smoke rising from the Saudi Aramco oil processing facility at Abqaiq, one of the most important oil processing sites on the entire planet, meaning this was not a hypothetical threat to Saudi Arabia. It was a real photographed strike on one of the kingdom's most critical pieces of energy infrastructure, and it is worth remembering just how significant that specific facility has been in the past. Abqaiq has been targeted before in a widely covered 2019 drone and missile attack that briefly knocked out a meaningful share of global oil supply overnight. So a fresh strike on the same complex in the middle of this war was never going to be read by markets or by regional governments as a small, routine incident. And before the American and Saudi response to that Iraq drone campaign even happened, President Trump had already previewed in public exactly how the United States intended to react. According to the National Desk's reporting, Trump said the U.S. had, in his own blunt words, got to smack them a little bit after Iran targeted American forces, a phrase that is worth sitting with for a moment, because it frames a strike that killed at least 20 militia fighters and 6 Iranian military advisors using deliberately casual, almost dismissive language, and that gap between the scale of the actual military action and the small, offhand way the sitting president described it in advance is, on its own, a detail worth noticing rather than skipping past. And Iran did not back down after the American and Saudi strikes on Iraq, according to the National Desk's reporting. Iran responded on Thursday by launching another barrage of missiles, and this new wave hit multiple countries at once. Jordan's military reported that it intercepted 5 missiles for the second straight day in a row, meaning Jordan had now been targeted with missile barrages on consecutive days. And separately, Kuwait reported that one person was killed after a missile struck a building owned by a Chinese company, and that detail matters for a reason beyond the tragedy itself. It shows this conflict was no longer only striking military bases. It was now killing civilian workers inside commercial buildings owned by companies from a country, China, that has no direct military role in this war at all. And the destruction did not stop at missiles either, according to the National Desk's reporting, citing the British maritime security firm Ambry. Drone strikes on that same Wednesday sparked fires aboard 2 separate natural gas vessels at Egypt's port of Damietta. And Egyptian officials said their preliminary investigations found the fires were caused by a drone, though, as of that reporting, no group had actually claimed responsibility for that specific strike, and this channel wants to be honest about that gap. We do not have confirmed attribution for the Damietta drone strike. The way we do for the missile attacks on Jordan and Kuwait, it is included here because it happened in the same narrow window and fits the same overall pattern of the war, spreading into new countries and new categories of target, oil tankers, gas vessels, commercial buildings. But responsibility for that specific incident remains genuinely unconfirmed in the reporting available, and there's a broader pattern worth naming here too, because this exact week was not the first time Iran targeted the Muwafaq Salti air base and the regional headquarters of U.S. Central Command inside Jordan. According to NPR's reporting, Iran's own paramilitary Revolutionary Guard stated directly in an announcement carried by the state-run IRNA news agency that it had fired ballistic missiles specifically at Muwafaq Salti Air Base and at the CENTCOM headquarters facility in Jordan. And Jordan's military response to that specific claim was direct: 5 Iranian missiles, intercepted and destroyed, with no immediate reports of casualties or damage. And this specific base, Muwafaq Salti, is not a random location in this story. It is the same base where, earlier in July, an Iranian missile and drone attack had already killed 2 American soldiers, meaning Iran returned to strike the exact same facility again within the same month. And there was also a genuinely revealing detail buried in Iran's own public statements from this same period. According to PBS NewsHour's reporting, Iranian government spokesperson Fatmeh Mohajerani gave a public accounting, carried by IRNA, of the damage Iran itself had suffered from earlier American strikes, stating that Bushehr International Airport on the Persian Gulf had been, in her words, rendered inoperable, and that both tunnels struck earlier in the war had since been reopened with alternate routes established around bridges that had been damaged. And she added that other civilian infrastructure had also been destroyed, specifically naming a meteorological center and fishing boats. And it is worth being precise about the source here. This is Iran's own government. Spokesperson describing Iran's own damage in Iran's own state media. It is a real, on-the-record statement, but it is not independently verified by any outside body, so it should be understood exactly as what it is, Iran's own official account of what it has lost, and separately, according to PBS NewsHour's reporting, the American military's own justification for the strikes that caused this damage was framed specifically around the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. said it had struck numerous military targets that month, specifically in response to Iranian attacks on commercial ships passing through the strait, and Iran in turn retaliated with its own missile and drone attacks on Arab countries that host American forces, which is exactly the same cycle that produced the events of this specific week. And there is one more thread worth including here, because it shows just how many separate fronts this war had opened by this point. According to PBS NewsHour's reporting, the Houthi movement in Yemen, a separate armed group aligned with Iran but operating independently in its own conflict, claimed to have fired missiles at a Saudi oil tanker called the NCC Ghazal, forcing the ship to turn back. And the Houthis had announced, just the week before, a blockade of Saudi shipping specifically through the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, the narrow waterway leading into the Red Sea, meaning that by this point in the summer of 2026, 2 separate maritime choke points, the Strait of Hormuz and the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, were simultaneously under threat from Iran-aligned forces, putting a genuinely enormous share of the world's oil shipping routes at risk at the exact same time. And PBS NewsHour's own reporting captured one more real-world consequence of all of this that rarely makes it into a purely military story. Americans' confidence in the U.S. economy fell again as the Iran conflict pushed gas prices higher, meaning this was not simply a story unfolding on the other side of the world. It was already showing up, measurably, in how ordinary Americans felt about their own household budgets. And diplomatically, the picture by the end of this specific week was genuinely mixed, according to the National Desk's reporting. Pakistan, which had helped broker the earlier interim agreement between the two sides, stated that diplomatic talks were continuing, still focused on reopening the Strait of Hormuz and lowering overall tensions. But that same report was honest about the real state of things, saying plainly that there had been little public sign of actual progress, even as both sides continued exchanging attacks. So, let's step back now and actually answer the question in tonight's title. Iran fired missiles, so the U.S. military did what, exactly? And the honest answer is that it did several specific documented things, almost all at once. It intercepted the initial missile barrage completely, according to CENTCOM's own statement. It partnered directly with Saudi Arabia within about a day to strike Iran-backed militia targets inside Iraq, killing at least 20 fighters and 6 Iranian military advisors. According to Iraqi officials, it issued a direct public warning to the IRGC and its regional proxy forces to stop the drone attacks or face further consequences. And it did all of this while still publicly describing its broader campaign, dating back to earlier that same month, as being fundamentally about protecting commercial shipping through the Strait of Hormuz rather than about regime change or open-ended escalation. And Iran, for its part, did not stand down after that American and Saudi response. It launched a second barrage of missiles the very next day, striking Jordan again and killing a civilian worker inside a Chinese-owned building in Kuwait, meaning the actual sequence here is not a single clean story of Iran attacking and America responding once. It is a rapid, multi-day, multi-country exchange missile attack, retaliatory airstrike, another missile attack, more interceptions, more casualties, spreading in the span of about 72 hours across Jordan, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and possibly Egypt. And here's the part of this story I think deserves the most honest attention, because it is easy to lose sight of amid all the missile counts and interception numbers. In the middle of this exchange, a diplomatic track was still technically alive. Pakistan was still working the phones. Both sides had, just days earlier, been observing an actual pause, specifically designed to give negotiators room to work. And that pause collapsed within one meeting between Trump and Netanyahu and one Iranian missile barrage. which tells you something real about how fragile this particular peace process has been at every single stage, not because either side necessarily wants all-out war, but because the trust required to sustain even a few days of quiet appears to be almost non-existent right now. And it is also worth thinking honestly about what success actually looked like for each side in this specific 72-hour window, because the two governments were, by their own public statements, measuring success in completely different ways. For the United States, according to CENTCOM's own repeated language, success meant a perfect interception record, 0 American missiles getting through, 0 reported casualties from the missile attacks themselves, paired with visible, immediate retaliation against Iran's regional proxies. For Iran, based on its own state media statements and the IRGC's own public claims about targeting CENTCOM's headquarters directly, success appeared to mean simply demonstrating the continued willingness and ability to strike back at all, regardless of whether the missiles actually got through, keeping the pressure and the uncertainty alive, rather than necessarily achieving a specific battlefield outcome. And those two definitions of success are not actually in direct conflict with each other, which may be part of why this cycle has proven so difficult to break. Both sides can plausibly claim, in their own domestic messaging, that this exchange went the way they wanted it to, even though from the outside it looks like nothing was resolved, and several new people, an unnamed worker in Kuwait, an unknown number of drone crew members in Iraq, are simply dead. And it is worth being honest about one more thing before we close. This channel has now covered several separate chapters of this same broader war: the strike on Fordo back in the summer of 2025, the attack on the undisclosed base in Jordan, this week's forced rebuilding of Iran's military leadership, the campaign against Iran's bridges and civilian infrastructure, and now this specific 72-hour exchange across 5 different countries. And taken together, what these separate stories actually show is not a war moving in one clear direction, toward victory for either side or toward a lasting peace. It is a war that keeps generating the same basic pattern over and over again: an attack, a retaliation, a brief pause, and then a collapse back into fighting, sometimes over the course of months, and in this case, over the course of a single week. And here's the question I genuinely want your honest answer to in the comments tonight. When a ceasefire or a pause collapses this quickly, within days, sometimes within hours of a single incident, do you think that shows both governments are still fundamentally looking for a way out of this war, testing pauses even though they keep failing? Or do you think it shows that neither side actually believes the other is negotiating in good faith, and that these pauses are really just tactical breathing room rather than genuine attempts at peace? There is a real, serious case for both readings, and I would rather hear where you land than pretend there's an obvious answer, because there isn't one, and this is very much not a finished story. As of the most recent reporting available, Pakistan's mediation effort was still ongoing. The Strait of Hormuz remained the single unresolved issue at the center of nearly every ceasefire attempt so far. The Houthi blockade threat in the Bab el-Mandeb Strait was still active, and responsibility for the drone strikes on the gas vessels at Egypt's port of Damietta remained genuinely unclaimed and unconfirmed. When the next verified development in this specific exchange breaks, whether that is a formal return to negotiations, another round of strikes, or confirmation of who was actually behind the Egypt drone attack, this channel will cover it exactly the way it covered. Tonight's story, with every figure traced back to a named government or a named outlet, every unverified claim labeled honestly as exactly that, and the genuinely unresolved parts of the story left open rather than smoothed over into something cleaner than what is actually currently known.